These three women, Christabel, Mary and Yvonne, were all brutally killed. But in each case, when their killer came to court, it was as if the dead woman were herself on trial. To get the killer off the charge of murder, the defense presented a one-sided view of the victim, which friends and family found outrageous. Does our legal system provide a fair hearing in cases like these? Is it right that no one speaks for the dead? Christabel Boyce was head-butted, then strangled by her husband Nicholas in January 1985. She is buried in the graveyard of the Essex village where she grew up. She was 32, a social worker with old people. The couple had been together for 6.5 years and had 2 small children.
She was extremely humorous. I never laughed with anybody as much as I've laughed with her about silly things, just silly everyday things. She was extremely kind-hearted. She was extremely generous. She'd never come and stay here without bringing some little tiny thing she'd picked up from somewhere that was worthless, but it was a thoughtful present. But she was always very aware that she couldn't offer hospitality back.
She was very lively. She liked fun. She liked to laugh. And the times we have had together were very jolly times.
She was a very strong-minded person. She sort of set goals in her life and set out to achieve them. And she was an optimist. That was her primary characteristic. Even when things really seemed down, she always looked forward to the future. She used to say, all I want from life is a small house out in the country with a patch of grass for my children to play on.
Meanwhile, they lived in a run-down area of Bethnal Green in East London. It was convenient for Nicholas's studies at the London School of Economics, where he was a postgraduate student. Neither of them liked living in London.
I don't think both of them didn't really fit into the community because their upbringing was very, very different from people's upbringing in this area. Especially the estate where they lived was considered to be quite rough. And she was such a gentle person.
She was killed by Nicholas on the night of the 13th of January in their flat. He spent all night cutting her body in the bath into over 100 pieces while the children slept in the next room. To disguise the fact that they were human remains, he cooked some, put them in plastic bags and disposed of them round London. He kept the secret for 6 days.
It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and he called at my house holding the 2 children, which I got the impression it was another social call. I mean, I'd only spoken to her a week before, or just over a week rather. But it was unusual for Nick to call with the 2 children. It normally had been her or maybe the 2 of them. So I asked them in, and there was something odd about his appearance. He looked, the only way I can describe it is he looked as though he was in shock. And he just looked at me and said to me, Ursula, I've killed Christabel. Will you please take the 2 children and I want to go to the police.
Nicholas Boyce told the police he had killed his wife in self-defence when she tried to knife him during a row. He admitted disposing of the body but said he couldn't remember where. The police were sceptical.
He believed that parts of his wife were so well hidden that they would never be recovered, and it would only be his version of events which was available for checking. The scene at the home had been cleaned, there was very little damage, and in the beginning it yielded very few clues. He probably hoped to defeat the investigation from the outset. His story didn't hold water, and in actual fact I interrogated him over some considerable long periods, and eventually he began to tell slightly different variations, and then eventually he yielded, and about 24 hours after he'd been with us, he told one of my detective constables where he'd actually disposed of part of his wife's body, and that was in this location here. and we began searching this river behind me and the banking. One of the officers spotted a parcel floating in the river, and this river here, the River Lee, and the parcel, which was a white plastic package, was caught up in the middle of the river. And when we pulled it in, it contained a human hand.
The search for the body was crucial if the police were to disprove Boyce's story, because only the body could provide the clues to exactly how she died. Bit by bit, he directed them where to look for more of the remains. A vital find came at Hungerford Bridge over the River Thames.
The most important piece to recover was the victim's head, and it was from that we hoped to establish the cause of death. On the second day, we recovered the head encased in concrete and plastic bags, and inside a large canvas bag. The post-mortem on that gave us the information we wanted. That was the real breakthrough when I was actually able to ask the pathologist to give me an established cause of death. And from that post-mortem that I attended then, I was able to go back and interrogate Mr. Boyce, and eventually he confessed that he'd strangled his wife with a ligature after ferociously beating her.
When the case came to trial at the Old Bailey, Nicholas Boyce pleaded not guilty to murder, which carries an automatic life sentence, but guilty only to manslaughter on the grounds that he had been provoked. In law, provocation is defined as
some act by the deceased which would cause any reasonable person a sudden and temporary loss of self-control, rendering him so subject to passion as to make him not, for the moment, master of his mind.
Well, obviously, to make it reasonable for most of us to lose our control such that we actually kill someone, you're going to have quite a serious degree of provocation. And so what might start off with a description of a woman who might be at times difficult, as most of us might well be, it has to be enlarged into the kind of provoking behaviour or words which would make any of us just go mad.
The police and prosecution felt the evidence indicated a premeditated murder. But in court, Boyce's defence took a new and unexpected line. The prosecution were caught off guard. The case now turned on the character and behaviour not of Nicholas, but of Christabel.
Why do you feel you killed Christabel?
Because I was terrified of her. And because she tortured and tormented me, and there was no way I could stop her. She lost no opportunity to humiliate and torment me.
When using a defence of provocation, counsel are supposed to observe certain guidelines.
Defence counsel should not, in the plea of mitigation, make any allegation which is merely scandalous or calculated to vilify or insult any person.
Although this rule exists, interpretations of it vary. Many of the people who knew Christabel well were horrified by the one-sided view of her presented at the trial.
We were just outraged. We just couldn't believe it. There she was to work with, a kind and gentle person, and the next minute she was being portrayed as such a terrible person nobody wanted to live with, or in this case his, and just wanted her dead. We just couldn't believe it.
It seemed to me that Nick wasn't on trial, it was Christabel who was on trial, and nobody was able to offer any defence on her part.
It does create that unique situation where the defendant with impunity can give an account which is almost unchallengeable. And in order to, if you like, add texture and colour to that, then obviously setting the scene by drawing a picture of the victim as perhaps less worthy, as someone whom one shouldn't be automatically sympathetic with, is what is the undercurrent of what's happening.
By the end, I was working days and nights. I took all the washing to be dried to the laundrette. I did about 9/10 of the shopping. On my nights off work, I fed the baby. She said my thesis was a complete waste of time and that I should give it up forthwith.
In fact, Christabel worked full-time at Bethnal Green Hospital for most of their married life. And she was the sole breadwinner for 2 years while Nicholas continued studying after his grant ran out. All her working life, Christabel had done caring jobs. But the court heard almost nothing of this, nor of her work record.
Very caring, very conscientious. I mean, nothing was too much trouble for her. I mean, I liked working with her enormously well. You know, really I found her very, very nice. Patients liked her. I mean, there really wasn't too much. She would do almost anything to help them.
Terry and Penny were old friends of Christabel. She had lived with Penny's family on and off during her childhood, whenever her mother was ill. They stayed close to Nick and Christabel throughout their marriage.
It was necessary for her to work because although Nick had some kind of entitlement to a grant, eventually this ran out, and so even after they had their first child, she had to go back to work to keep the family and to pay his tuition fees. And she managed this by Nick looking after the child during the day. At that stage, of course, the child was very small, and so it didn't make very many demands on Nick, and she would leave everything ready so that the child could be fed and changed, and there again she would cope with the rest of the housework and everything else at weekends and in the evenings. It's quite difficult to see her at that stage because she had so much to do.
For Christabel, time with her child was limited.
That was as important as looking after a child was to see that Nick followed the career he wanted to, that she was even prepared to give up her child because she was really so keen that Nick do what he wanted to do in life. And it was only when she started to lose faith in his getting the PhD that she wanted to turn at looking after her own child, and she gave up work and asked him if he'd do some work.
I think that he was, in a sense, perfectly happy to continue with the thesis for evermore and evermore. And I don't think that he particularly relished the prospect of having to come to terms with the ordinary workaday life that most of us have to lead.
At 37, Nicholas had never had a steady job. Now he found work as a night cleaner at a hostel for the homeless. He could get through his work there quickly to give himself plenty of time to study. 5 months before Christabel's death, he found a second part-time job. He now earned over £160 a week and claimed he gave up to £100 of this to Christabel for housekeeping, but she squandered it. Prosecuting counsel.
There were complaints from her that she only had a pair of sandals to wear and wanted a pair of shoes.
There were.
All made up, was it?
I don't know what Christabel did with the money. I never gave her less than £80 a week. And there was one week I gave her £140 because she was complaining about shoes.
Was that right? She only had sandals?
No, it's not right.
She had lots of shoes.
No, she didn't have lots of shoes. She didn't just have sandals.
So what I want you to do is I want you just to walk over there to that...
Ursula was a colleague and friend of Christabel's. She remembers Christabel complaining to her about Nicholas's meanness.
He expected her to wear jumble clothes most of the time. And on one occasion I remember when she asked him for a pair of shoes for her birthday. He point blank refused, and the next day apparently he bought himself a very expensive smoking pipe. So to me it always seemed as though the values there were completely wrong too.
I think there are a number of people who could have spoken about Nicholas and his general attitude to life and his work, who were not called to give evidence. I think it's quite extraordinary that in fact no witnesses were called for either side who knew the couple at all well or had been in the habit of spending time with them. Nobody at all was there who really knew them.
The problem lies in the nature of English law. The prosecution has to present its case without knowing precisely what the defence will be, and so may be caught off guard.
there certainly was a body of evidence available here which could have countered many of the things that were said about the victim. Now the question is, first of all, Crown Counsel in many cases may feel that the evidence which is available and which has been prepared is in itself enough. They may feel that it would be excessive prosecuting. It would seem to be unfair to be digging up every little ounce of character evidence and history of a marriage, which for most of us there can be incidents which would tell against us. So there is a reluctance to do that. But thirdly, there is in our system, like it or not, a feeling that the Crown's role is one of impartiality and that they shouldn't be seen to be taking on the position of defending the victim, and that they don't have to perform that function. And I feel that prosecuting counsel should perhaps be much more mindful of the victim.
It was open to prosecution counsel, Anthony Scrivener, to produce character witnesses to counter the defence. This is called evidence in rebuttal. But this is rarely done and wasn't in this case.
But in circumstances where really there has been a vilification of a victim, then we ought to allow rebuttal, and judges should be much more prepared to do so. Interestingly enough, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, there is now a body of case law moving in that direction, and courts are allowing that. And it is precisely with this in mind, seeing the ways in which there can be a terrible injustice done to a victim because he or she is not there to tell the tale. And an account which could be useful to a jury should be allowed in those circumstances.
Character witnesses, however, can be called for the defendant. Nicholas and Christabel once stayed with this woman in Christabel's home village when Christabel was suffering from stress. It had been brought on by overwork and living in London, and her doctor suggested she needed time away to recover. But this woman did not see Nicholas or Christabel again in the 2 years before the trial. In court, she was asked a direct question about Christabel. She admitted that she was very warm and had a great sense of humour, but she produced another statement which was very damaging to Christabel.
One day, when they were living with us, she spent £40 on a jar of face cream, which I thought at the time was a bit extravagant, as they were in such dire straits.
As the only character witness the court heard, her evidence must have carried great weight.
Well, it seems extraordinary to me that somebody such as myself, who was having regular contact with them both until 4 months before her death, couldn't give any evidence as to their personalities, because that's what it appears the court case came down to. And yet somebody who hadn't seen them both for 3 years, and in fact had seen Christabel during a period of illness in which the Christabel who died bore no resemblance to the person of 1982. And yet they were able to give evidence and say what they wished to say.
It seems widely held that friends of the deceased may not give any really relevant evidence. It's thought that they would simply bound to say that the deceased person was just simply good or kind to animals or whatever, and so that evidence is not relevant. And I do think that this gives the defendant a remarkable opportunity to speak freely and often perhaps not truthfully about that relationship. It also strikes me that in those circumstances, those who might be called as witnesses for the defence may also feel that they can speak more freely than they might otherwise do, because people who knew more about the circumstances and were friends of the deceased will not be in court, won't be there.
Christabel's friends felt so strongly that they wrote complaining to the Director of Public Prosecutions. He replied,
Although there will be witnesses who could be called by the prosecution to give evidence to present a more balanced picture of the relationship, in this instance such evidence, whilst being highly relevant, was unfortunately not admissible as evidence, as it would have offended against the hearsay rules.
hearsay are communications which take place between parties without the defendant being present. And the rule generally is quite a sensible one, which is that if the defendant himself isn't there, then he can't comment on whether something was said mockingly or said in fun or said in a way which wasn't to be taken seriously, or whether the person said it vindictively.
But several witnesses could have given evidence about revealing incidents which occurred when they were with both Christabel and Nicholas.
Most of us can say that we have, if we've spent time with a couple, that we have a sense on occasions of where they have perhaps what the quality of the relationship is really like has filtered through to us. And in many of these cases, there are people who are close enough to the individuals who might at least give the jury the sense of what someone is like, and perhaps give a different reflection on the image that's being created of the victim in the courtroom.
Throughout 1984, the marriage went from bad to worse. Christabel eventually decided to get a divorce. Solicitors for both of them began drawing up a separation agreement.
I remember a phone call, I believe it was last August. She confided in me that there were marital problems, and that was the first indication I ever had that there was anything wrong between the two. She was saying to me that they were going to get a divorce, and when I asked her how did she feel about the divorce, she said, how did he feel about the divorce? She said, he feels very, very angry. And all I can say is afterwards, the few occasions I went to the house after this conversation, the atmosphere was just very, very horrible.
She complained very little. She was an extraordinarily patient person. But she had said that things were extremely difficult at home, and she had finally come to the realization that they could not possibly continue to go on together, and that she would have to try and make a break. And then there was a longish period in which, although she still complained relatively little, she appeared to be extremely frightened. It's very hard to say specifically what made her afraid, because she was still very loyal and she wouldn't complain about her husband, but she was behaving as one who was terrified at times, and she was very apprehensive about anything that might possibly upset him.
Christabel wrote to her godmother 3 months before her death.
His behaviour is very odd, and he says he hates and despises me, and for that I'm sorry. At times I'm so afraid of what he might actually do, and I'm actually fearing he might decide to get rid of me. He can be very threatening.
But this letter was never read in court.
What we don't know is the state of mind Christabel was in at the time. Sometimes that kind of communication is written to soften a blow, perhaps like the fact that there was likely to be a divorce in the offing. And people sometimes are not reflecting a true reality, either deliberately or sometimes not even deliberately. It's not even intentional. But it can't be questioned very readily by the defendant through his lawyers, because he was not a party to it. And so those rules exist for good reason. What some people would say is that juries are sensible people and they can decide themselves what weight to attach to such communications.
In court, Nicholas claimed to be afraid of Christabel.
I was terrified of her when she was angry. And I know that when she was a child and a teenager, her sister said that the family wouldn't speak to her for days, rather than risk a confrontation with her.
During her childhood, Christabel was sometimes looked after by Mrs. Hanscom, Penny's mother.
When I heard, said at the trial, that she had a mighty temper, I find that this was not so. I've never seen Christabel in a temper, ever. Yes, she could be cross like we all can at times, but usually this was in defence of others, because she felt they had been treated unjustly.
Nicholas, as time went on, seemed to friends to be behaving more and more oddly.
It was in my last conversation with her on the telephone about 4 days before her death. She'd said to me that she was very concerned because her exact words were, "I think I think Nick needs help. He's acting most peculiar. And I, in fact, asked her what she meant and what way he was acting peculiar. And at that moment, her son came into the room, so she said, I can't talk about it now, but since I was going to see her within the next couple of weeks, she'd tell me about it then.
Well, I think that there is much that we, and indeed other people who knew both the parties extremely well, could have said about what we observed of the decline of their relationship and of the increasing feeling we had of Nicholas's loss of connection with the real world. He was increasingly self-absorbed, and we thought he was becoming profoundly depressed. And I think that without quoting conversations that we'd had with Christabel when she had been with us by herself, we could have said a great deal as to what we had observed when they had been with us together, and about what Nicholas himself had said and done on particular occasions.
The fact that nobody was called to speak for Christabel was to be crucial to the outcome of the trial.
After August, I would try and keep out of rows. I would just try and say nothing. Rather than row, I would do anything to try and stop, just to say nothing.
Nicholas Boyce claimed the tension between himself and Christabel in their cramped flat culminated in a final row, started by Christabel. He said he was sitting quietly smoking his pipe when she complained about the smell. It was tainting her clean washing. She snatched his pipe and broke it. He lit another one. She broke this one too. Then he claimed she flicked ash into his face and jabbed a lighted cigarette into his hair. Finally, he lost control and killed her.
I've never believed that the killing occurred in the context of a final enormous row. I think that she would have done anything to have avoided having any kind of confrontation with him. I think that he must finally have realised from something that she was doing that she was actually going, and I think then he decided to stop her.
Christabel told me they were having enormous rows, but that was until December, and when she came to stay in December, she told me that they weren't rowing anymore, there was no point anymore, she wasn't getting through. She was going to take up the next accommodation that came available, providing that the roof wasn't leaking, were her very words. And she told me that she had lost respect for him, and she'd always been so loyal to him in the past that I felt this was a crucial time for her. So, I mean, I don't doubt she said some pretty nasty things to him. I mean, I don't know if that's an excuse to kill somebody.
The jury found him not guilty of murder, but guilty only of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 years. Judge Miskin gave him 2 years concurrent for unlawfully disposing of the body. With remission and parole, he could be out after just 2 years.
At first, because it was all so grotesque, I needed to believe that she deserved it, like the jury. But how can one human being who was born with children, cared for him, remained so loyal over so long, do that to another person? And so I could only comfort myself by saying that she must have deserved it, that what went on behind those closed doors nobody knows about. But ultimately, as 18 months has passed, I have to face the facts. I have to incorporate what I knew about Christabel over a long, long time and just know that events didn't happen like that. That she didn't have that row that night, that she wouldn't have broken pipes. She had just the previous year been discussing what she should buy Nick for a birthday with me. And I'd said, oh, why not get him a special pipe, thinking that was something personal, me like a special pipe. And she'd said to me, no, there's no point, because he breaks his pipes when he gets angry and frustrated. And so the whole scenario of what happened, I, from my knowledge of them both, just can't believe it all happened like that. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling to live with.
It's the shortness of the sentence and the final result that makes one think. Before the trial, we knew of a horrendous crime and we found it inconceivable that the process of law wouldn't result in a very long sentence indeed. However, now we feel that had we been at the trial, at the very least we could have passed notes to prosecution saying that all sorts of things that are being said on behalf of the defence are quite false, and that we can definitely testify that these are false. And this is not about necessarily what the deceased said, but what happened and what was done. We think that that would have made a significant contribution to the way that the trial went.
Another case where no one spoke for the dead occurred here in Winchester. The dead woman lies buried in this graveyard alongside her brother, who died young in an accident. She was Mary Bristow. She was 36, a librarian for 15 years, a friendly, outgoing woman whose striking appearance, she was over 6 foot tall, made her well known in the town. She was killed by Peter Wood. He'd been a lodger in her house and her lover. He came to trial at Winchester Crown Court in June 1982. Peter Wood pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty only to manslaughter on the grounds of provocation and diminished responsibility. Again, the trial focused on the victim's personality and her lifestyle. Mr. Patrick Back, representing Peter Wood, told the jury,
Mary had a brilliant intellect and an IQ of 182. She was also middle class, and as sometimes happens with very clever people, she was in a state of rebellion against the morality favoured by that class. She regarded marriage as, at any rate, something not for her. I suppose she thought of it as something that would restrict her freedom. Therefore she took lovers. She was a devotee of many causes: the women's liberation movement, pro-abortion, and CND demonstrations.
Mary Bristow's friends and family were outraged at the portrayal of her, her mother among them.
It was unrecognisable from the Mary we knew or any of her friends. It wasn't Mary at all. Mary's sensitive nature and compassion and all that sort of thing didn't come out. She sounded like a freak, who didn't care about anything but these freakish things she got into. Mary was a caring girl.
One night a week, Mary worked behind the bar in this pub, the Willow Tree, run by Monica and Derek Carpenter.
It wasn't the Mary that anybody knew, I feel. It was a complete distortion of character, or an assassination of character, if you like. We all felt that Mary was on trial and not the chap who was up in the dock.
She could not defend herself because she wasn't there. And she was on trial by inference, not on factual evidence.
Brian Murphy lived next door to Mary. He was in court throughout the trial.
There was no one brought her in court to give any defence, if you like, from Mary's point of view, a good characterisation, anything like that. Mary was just left to suffer. And that's all I can say. She was just left to suffer. I mean, it would appear to me that anybody could stand up in that court and say what they like about Mary and get away with it.
The court never had a full picture of the real Mary.
She was kind, generous, and remarkably compassionate to those that she felt were in need of help.
She also had an amazing sense of humour, which made her very good behind the bar, and just got on with people generally very well,
She wasn't a sort of, a wild, reckless girl. She was a very sort of gentle creature, really. Wouldn't harm anybody, would do anything for anybody, absolutely anything. They don't have to come and tap on the door and ask them. She'd say, come in, sit down, have a cup of tea. It reminds me of one of these agony columns, agony ants. She was always there, willing to help people.
Mary had bought a small house with the help of her parents. Peter Wood became her lodger in 1976.
She must have been in the house about 6 months. And this Sunday she said she had taken a lodger. And in a way we were glad, because she found the mortgage rather heavy and she was finding it difficult to pay all the expenses. And we thought, well, that's a good thing, but we thought a man, that's a bit unconventional. And she said, well, I'll have to see how it works out, she said. He told me that his father had thrown him out and that he was a deserter from the Rhodesian army and lots of other things. She said, well, I can't believe a word he says. No? She was a bit amused at all these stories.
Annie Robinson, an archaeologist, was another friend of Mary's.
She didn't like to have it thought that he was her boyfriend, although she did acknowledge that she had a relationship with him, but she didn't see it as being equivalent of a couple living together or a man and wife. He was definitely on those terms of paying rent.
Peter Wood, Mary's killer, explains it like this.
Well, I was already Mary's lover by the time I'd moved in. Although, yes, I did pay Mary rent. She didn't ask for it, but it was a matter, I mean, obviously there are expenses to running a house, and it's only fair that one shares in those expenses.
We never saw him, but we could hear him upstairs. The spare bedroom was over Mary's sitting room, and we sat there on Sunday afternoon. We could hear the TV going upstairs. We never saw this man.
The relationship that I had with Mary was very strong sexually, and probably not, and very weak intellectually. And that is why it appeared to be the case that I was someone who was sort of kept in a cupboard and brought out when the occasion was required it, you know. And I can see that that's how the idea grew up, that I was a sort of lodger rather than the boyfriend, because I wasn't on the same intellectual footing as most of Mary's friends or ex-boyfriends or indeed friends, you know. And in a way, yes, Mary was rather embarrassed, I suppose, about me. Well, she certainly wasn't proud, let's put it that way.
They'd have various rows, and he'd move out or she'd throw him out, and then eventually he would come back, and she'd be the big sot of it. She was, let him back in again.
Mary asked me to leave 2 or 3 times. And I mean, she accepted me back because I think she actually realised how much I depended upon her.
It took months and months before she did get rid of him. And by then she was exasperated. We felt so sorry for her. And we wondered what we could do, you know? And she said, oh, I can manage it, I can manage it. Now, Mary could manage most things. And as she was well over 30 years of age, we thought, you know, why should we interfere? We didn't like to interfere.
In May 1981, Mary thought she had managed it at last. She wrote to a friend,
I'm in fine fettle at the moment. I've managed to dislodge my parasitic lodger by dramatic means, calling a taxi, inserting him in it with his numerous bags and suitcases, and refusing him access thereafter.
But he kept coming back.
She realised, I think, that by then, that it was much more serious than she'd ever imagined, that he was much more obsessed with her than he ever had been previously.
She really didn't want him there anymore. But every time she managed to get him out of the place, he would come back, getting in whatever way he felt inclined to. So the relationship had finished completely, but he wasn't obviously accepting the fact.
I felt that my emotional support was going to be removed, and I didn't have the inner reserves or whatever, the emotional backbone to sort of stand on my own 2 feet. And I'd become so heavily dependent upon Mary, emotionally and psychologically, that I knew that once that support was removed, I was in danger of collapse.
She did one night come in and I said, well, for goodness sake, why don't you go to the police and do something about it? And her attitude was, I don't think it's the police I need, I think it's a doctor he needs. But you see, again, she wouldn't protect herself because she still felt that she could, I don't know, help him or whatever. But that was the sort of person she was.
In October 1981, in the early hours of the morning, Peter Wood came back to Mary's house once more. He got in and waited till Mary returned from seeing a friend. He claims they made love, then he fetched a meat tenderizer, battered her with it, smothered her with a pillow, and strangled her. Because Peter Wood never denied he killed her, the trial focused on the question of whether Mary had so provoked him by her behaviour that any reasonable man would have done what he did.
Well, I didn't want to escape a life sentence at the expense of Mary's reputation. That certainly was never my intention.
Despite this, his defence still depended on the idea that Mary had manipulated him. Defence counsel said,
"There was between him and Mary Bristow what you may think of as a very strange relationship, in which a gifted and older woman took him in hand and sought to fashion him into something she thought superior, but which his birth and background did not design him to be. The 6-year-old relationship was a Pygmalion or My Fair Lady situation in reverse. She took the part of a female Professor Higgins, and he was Eliza Doolittle."
I didn't want the plea of provocation used. I made that quite clear to my barrister to begin with. And I sent him a note prior to going to trial in which I said to him that I do not see how a person can provoke their own death. And Mary certainly didn't provoke her own. And that I would go to court and ask the jury to accept that when I did what I did, the state of my mind was unbalanced, and if they wouldn't accept that, then that was just, I'd have to accept that. Now, when one is in that situation, when you're involved with the law and that you're on a serious charge, and you've got a lot of high-powered people around you, and you accept their opinion as being the right one.
The judge, in his summing up, reinforced the defence's portrayal of the relationship.
Mary Bristow, IQ 182, obviously very bright, rebel from her middle-class background, unorthodox in her pattern of living. If this case teaches us one lesson, it may be that the cleverest people are not always very wise. Those who indulge in sexual relationships should realize that sex is one of the deepest and most powerful of all human motivations. And if you're playing with sex, you are playing with fire.
If a woman falls short of the traditional standards of what are expected of a woman, or if she is not conforming to the stereotype of what a good woman is like, then she is going to be diminished in the eyes of those who are hearing about her. And that, of course, is something which emanates from the rest of our society anyway. But we see it in courtrooms particularly because they are so male and because the ethos is so male.
It may be that the conventions which surround sex, however much some people may think them old hat, are there to prevent people from burning themselves. You may think it rather difficult to imagine any setup more plainly calculated to lead to precisely the kind of disaster which followed. Talk about playing with fire.
In cases like this, it's too easy and it's too shoddy and it's too lazy to portray the woman as a scarlet woman, the person who tempted man aside, because that's really what it's going back to. She was said to have been playing with sex. Well, she wasn't playing with sex. She wasn't dissolute or anything like that. She was just a perfectly normal person who had a very occasional and long-term relationship with one man. That's not playing with sex. And it does seem that in these cases where a woman is involved, that she's treated differently.
You have attitudes to women permeating the summings up, often ones which are really out of time and inconsistent with the way that people live their lives today, are often very male-defined, and which would outrage many women if they heard in detail what some judges up and down the country were saying.
Peter Wood was found guilty only of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 years and released after 4. Yet another case where no one spoke for the dead was that of Yvonne Swaffer. She was 16 when she died. She grew up in the Kent village of Great Chart. She had just started work as a secretary at the local perfume factory. She was an active member of her local church.
Well, she was full of life, but she was quiet and she was shy. But like myself, she was keen on cricket.
Well, she was very quiet. I mean, she'd only just 16. She worked, as you know, in a factory, and if the men there used to joke with her, she used to blush, which they thought was very rare, but she was that type of girl.
One night in July 1973, Yvonne went to a discotheque with friends. They left around midnight, said goodbye, and Yvonne set off alone to walk the mile home. On the way, she encountered a stranger, Ronald Birchall. He claimed that she asked him for a cigarette, and when he put his arm around her, she put his hand on her breast. He claimed she agreed to sex with him, but then changed her mind. To stop her screaming, he stuffed her tights into her mouth and she choked to death on them. Birchall was arrested 4 weeks later and charged with murder. The case came to trial at Maidstone Crown Court in November 1973. But just before the trial, counsel for the prosecution, Sir Harold Castle, agreed to accept Birchall's plea of guilty not to murder, but only to manslaughter due to provocation, accepting that Yvonne initially agreed to sex with Birchall, though she was still a virgin and had her period at the time. So there was no trial, no need for a jury. Birchall simply came before the judge for sentence.
When my husband and I, we went in the court and sat there, wondering with apprehension what was going to happen, because I've never been in a court like that before, and neither of us had. And the jury were there, and standing in one corner and talking, and then presently they all began to file out, and we hadn't a clue what was going on. Anyway, the proceedings started with a series of statements about Yvonne, which nobody repudiated, nobody was questioned, and it was all over in less than 60 minutes.
I thought myself that the evidence was sufficiently strong to go before jury, and that it's essentially, in a case of this kind, where a defence involves blackening the character of someone who's no longer alive and unable to meet the charges against her, particularly, as in this case, a young girl, it's really essential that a jury should decide an issue of that kind, rather than that it should be one left to counsel and the judge between them. Of course, there are cases where it would be right for a lesser charge to be accepted. I felt that this was not such a case at all, and that the girl's parents and others who knew her would necessarily feel tremendous sense of anguish at what was said about her in court, which really was not in accordance with what I found out as to the evidence.
However, the judge accepted that Birchall had killed her accidentally after provocation and sentenced him to only 4 years.
We were stunned. I was appalled at first to see the miscarriage of justice, and well, we just stood outside the court and talked to friends and that, and nobody could understand how justice could be seen to be done in a way like that.
That case, to me, smacks of male decision-making, in that you had a young woman who, on any account, was very young, was described as being a virgin, who at the time of the incident was menstruating. And I think a woman approaching that issue would probably have brought to it a rather different information. I mean, we would have felt rather differently, because very few inexperienced people sexually are going to consider their first experience of intercourse in the context of having their period. And it probably never even crossed the minds of the men who were involved in that case or in the decision to accept a plea that she was a willing party to this sexual interlude which led to her death. And unfortunately, a lot of those decisions are based on that kind of lack of appreciation of what would make a woman tick. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we have to have more women involved in the legal processes.
The Swaffers were so distressed by the proceedings, as were many people in the village, that they wrote to the Attorney General.
Maidstone Crown Court, 1st of November 73. Sir, we are the parents of Yvonne Swaffer, the victim referred to in the above trial. We are very distressed and disillusioned by the result of the trial. We were present in court. We enclose copies of the press reports, but you will no doubt have the official transcript. We regarded the trial as a complete mockery, there being no witnesses whatsoever called. We've got as many as 17 sort of questions that we wanted to ask, and they are included in this letter. And we've also taken legal advice and would welcome any publicity or advice that could bring the true facts of this brutal murder to its true light, and so clear the name of our dear daughter, who we have every reason to believe died for her honour. We are not vindictive, but we want to see justice.
A year after Yvonne's death, their fight to clear her name brought an apology from Lord Silkin.
Yvonne Swaffer's moral character ought not to have been impugned in court in circumstances which gave no opportunity for the allegations against her character to be traversed or even questioned. I deeply regret the pain which must have been caused by what occurred, and I very much hope that the mistakes made can be regarded as isolated, though deeply regrettable, errors of judgment.
I was pleased that it cleared Yvonne's name and the truth came out at last, that it should have been a murder charge. And also, you know, I'd hoped that it would do some good for other people. That was mainly, I think, that this sort of thing should not go on.
Still today, the same defect in our system of justice can prevent the court getting a full picture of the crime in cases of killing where provocation is alleged. To make sure juries reach the right verdict and judges pass an appropriate sentence, someone should speak for the dead.